John 1 through 18 is what's known as the Prologue of John. And the rest of the Gospel is really meant to be read in light of those verses. In the rest of the Gospel, you're going to see the themes that are laid out in the Prologue. Themes like Jesus is the light, Jesus is the eternal God, and Jesus is the one that perfectly reveals the Father. And these things are written in the same reason for the rest of the Gospel. They are written so that you might know that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In the beginning harkens all the way back to Genesis 1:1. And the word for word here is logos, and it speaks of God's creative power, his creative capacity to merely speak things into existence. The word here is Jesus, and the word was with God. That means that Jesus was with God the Father from all eternity. And the word was God means that from the very outset of John's gospel, he wants us to know that Jesus is God. He is divine. And what this means for us is that Jesus isn't just some historical figure that you could just push off to the side. You owe him everything. You owe him your life, your money, your family, your cars, your heart, your soul. You owe him everything. John 1:2. He was in the beginning with God. This is making the very same point that John 1:1 made. Jesus was with God from the very beginning. How can you be with God, the Father, if you are not God yourself? This means that as far back as you want to go into eternity, as far back as you want to go into creation, Jesus has always been there. You can't escape him. You can't ignore him. He has been there and he will always be there. 1:3. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. This is picking up on the first two verses where we see that Jesus was at the beginning in creation and the fact that Jesus is God himself. When we look at the Old Testament, we see that the one who creates all things is God. And that's what John wants us to know, is that Jesus is the creator of all things. He creates the heavens. He creates the earth. He is not a created being. He's not an angel. He's not Michael the archangel. He's the one that brings every single thing into existence. John 1:4. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. This is further picking up on the themes that we saw in verses 2 and 3, where we see that Jesus is the creator of all things. In Genesis, we see these things. We see life. We see light. And what John wants us to know is that Jesus is the source of life. He's the source of all things. He gives life to every single thing. If you have existence, you owe your existence to Jesus. If you don't have Jesus, you don't have life and you don't have light. 1:5. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. What we see in Genesis 1 is the light breaking through the darkness in creation. And what we saw earlier is that Jesus is the light of the world. And this breaking through of the light is a foretaste, it's a shadow of Jesus' entrance into the world as a man to save his people from their sins. So whatever the darkness tries to do, it's ultimately going to be unsuccessful. It cannot impede the work of Jesus. It cannot impede the work of the light because the darkness has not and cannot overcome the light. 1:6. There came a man sent from God whose name was John. When we look at the Old Testament, we see that those that were sent from God were prophets. What this is telling us is that John the Baptist is a prophet. He is one that is sent from God. He is a mouthpiece for God to speak the very words of God. Now, John the Baptist is not designated as the Baptist here, but it is clear that from the following verses that this is John the Baptist, and the fact that no other John is named in the Gospel of John. John 1:7. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. Earlier in the Synoptic Gospels, what you have in John the Baptist's ministry is a focus on preaching of repentance in baptism. Here in the Gospel of John, it's a little different. The focus is on the witness, the testimony. And John the Baptist's testimony here is about the light, Jesus Christ. And the focus and intention of this witness, this testimony, is so that all might believe. John 1:8. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The author of the Gospel of John wants us to differentiate between John the Baptist and Jesus. Jesus is the true light, and John the Baptist came to bear witness about that true light. Apparently, John the Baptist and his ministry had a far-reaching impact. What we see in the book of Acts is that there were some that only knew of John the Baptist and his ministry. But the author of the Gospel of John wants us to recognize that John the Baptist and his ministry are subservient to Jesus because Jesus is the true light. John 1:9. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. In the Gospel of John, you have this designation over and over again: the true vine, the true worshipers, the true God. And what John wants us to know is that Jesus is the only source of light and life for all of mankind. This light had created the world, and now this light is coming into the world. John 1:10. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. The great and tragic irony that you see here is that although Jesus created the world, when he enters into that world, he faces rejection. He faces opposition. Instead of being received by the world that he created, he is rejected by that world. And what this means for us is that as Christians, we face rejection in the world all the time, but it's nothing really compared to the rejection that Jesus faced by his own creation. When he creates the world, he enters into that world, and yet that world does not receive him. Instead, they reject him. John 1:11. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. This is picking up on verse 10, where we saw that Jesus was rejected by the world. Verse 11 goes a little bit further when it tells us that he was rejected by his own people, the Jewish people. Instead of receiving him, they crucified him. But this was all a part of God's plan because it was prophesied in Isaiah 6, where we saw that the people's hearts would be hardened. We also see it in Isaiah 53, where it says, "Who has believed our report?" So when we see the Messiah rejected by the world and by his very own people, we can take heart that this was all a part of God's prophesied sovereign plan. 1:12. But to those who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Here we see a couple of things. We see that, number one, you're not a child of God simply by lineage, by birth, or by ethnicity. You have to receive him. You have to believe in his name. This also goes against this common notion that we are all somehow children of God. While it's true that we're all created in the image of God, to become children of God, you have to actually receive him and believe in his name, and then you will be adopted into his family and become a child of God. 1:13. Who were born not of blood, nor of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. Earlier in verse 12, we saw that to become a child of God, you had to receive and believe in Jesus' name. In verse 13, John gives us the explanation as to why the children of God believe. Is it because of their bloodline? Is it because of their heritage? Is it because of their parents? Is it that they are somehow spiritually better than everybody else? No, it's not because of anything within them. John actually points us to something that's happened in the past, and he points us also to something outside of man. The people of God, the children of God, believe because they have been born of God. Another way to put it is that the children of God believe because they've been born again. 1:14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We have seen his glory. Glory is of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Here the word refers to God the Son, Jesus Christ, taking on the form of a man. He doesn't cease to be God, but he simply adds to himself a human nature. And dwelt refers to the tabernacle, where God dwelt with his people. Now in the New Testament, God dwells with his people in the person of Christ. And glory refers to that glory that filled that Old Testament tabernacle. Jesus Christ has that glory because he is the monogenes, the one and only unique Son of God. He is the gracious one, dispensing all unmerited favor. And he is the standard of truth for every single individual. So what we see in the end is God condescending to man's level, because man cannot ascend up to God. 1:15. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me." Here we have the testimony of John the Baptist spelled out more clearly from verses 7 and 8. His testimony is that even though Jesus comes after John the Baptist, Jesus still has a higher rank. And what is the reason that he gives? He says, he comes before me. This is what we saw earlier in verses 1 and 2, that Jesus was there from the beginning. He has eternally been God from all of eternity. And so this is the reason why John the Baptist says, he comes before me. 1:16, for from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. This is picking up on verse 14 where we saw Jesus' glory and that he was full of grace and truth. Here it is said that we have received from his fullness, speaking of Jesus' immeasurable bounty of riches that he bestows on his people. Grace upon grace will be spelled out a little bit more in verse 17. But here it is worthy of noting that the only ones that receive grace upon grace are the ones that receive and believe in Jesus Christ. Those are the only ones that receive grace upon grace. John 1:17, for the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. This is further explaining what we saw in verse 16 where it says that we received grace upon grace. The first grace we received was the Old Testament law. And some people look at the law as something other than gracious, but when we look at it carefully, we see it as God's ethical boundaries for our behavior. And it's God's revelation of his character as well. The other grace we received is the grace that we received by salvation, by trusting in Christ by faith alone. We're saved by grace, the grace that comes through Jesus Christ. John 1:18, no one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. When it says that no one has ever seen God, surely there's been people in the Old Testament that have seen God, but they've only seen glimpses of God. They haven't seen God intimately. Jesus is at the Father's side. This is what is being echoed in verse 1, where it says that Jesus was with God. The Word was with God. When it says that he has made him known, it literally means that Jesus has exegeted him. He's explained God the Father. Only Jesus can do that because he is at the Father's side. He has explained him